You're such a joke, Dad. Can't you just stay out of our lives? The words hit me like the icy wind blowing through the streets of Erie, Pennsylvania, the kind that cuts straight through your jacket and sinks into your bones. I had just walked into the dining room for Christmas dinner, my arms full of presents and a heart full of hope, only to be met with laughter, mocking, cruel, deliberate. My own son Michael had said it, my own flesh and blood. I froze, the turkey roasting in the oven filling the air with its savory scent, the smell of cinnamon and pine from the tree behind him mingling with humiliation. My daughter-in-law, Jenna, smirked behind her fork, looking like she'd rehearsed this moment for months. My grandchildren were too young to fully understand, but their eyes mirrored confusion. I took a deep breath. I had survived worse in my life, but this sting cut differently. Family was supposed to be a sanctuary. And yet here I was, standing in my own house, feeling like a stranger. Before I continue, if you're new here, please like, comment, and subscribe. And tell us where you're watching from. I hadn't come here for confrontation. Not yet. I came to share a holiday meal with my family. My life had been a series of sacrifices. Working long hours as a plumber in this small town, sometimes double shifts, just to make sure my kids had a roof over their heads, clothes on their backs, and enough for a proper Christmas. I had spent decades ensuring they never lacked. Yet here I was, treated like I had no value. Growing up, I had learned resilience the hard way. My father had walked out when I was 12, leaving my mother to pick up the pieces. I promised myself I'd never abandon my children. But loyalty, I was learning, wasn't always reciprocated. The house smelled of pine, baked goods, and a subtle tinge of burnt sugar from my attempts at dessert. I looked around at the table, a symbol of celebration now tainted with contempt. Michael's laughter, Jenna's eyes rolling, the subtle snickers from cousins. It was unbearable. I felt anger rise, but I suppressed it. I knew impulsive reactions could ruin everything. My hand hovered over a plate, steadying myself. "Michael," I said quietly, "I don't know why you're acting like this. I've worked my entire life to make sure you had everything, and you treat me like this?" He waved me off with a grin. "Everything? You mean the bills, the chores, the lectures? That's not everything. That's boring, Dad. Real life is about living now, and you're embarrassing yourself trying to cling to the past." Embarrassing myself? I almost laughed. Almost. But I knew then that this Christmas, this dinner, would mark a turning point. I wouldn't let humiliation define me. Not tonight, not ever. I smiled faintly, nodding, pretending to be calm while my mind raced. Plans, contingencies, the law, the bank, small-town gossip, these were all tools I had at my disposal. Michael had underestimated me, as he often did. But every small-town injustice eventually meets its reckoning, and I intended to be the one holding the ledger. I served the mashed potatoes, my hands steady despite the rush of betrayal. Jenna's smirk faltered as she noticed my composure. Michael, emboldened by his arrogance, didn't see the storm gathering in my calm expression. This dinner would end differently than he imagined. This Christmas wouldn't be about laughter at my expense. It would be the night truth, patience, and preparation unveiled their power. And just as I began to serve the gravy, a subtle smile crept across my face. Because tonight, he didn't yet know, it wasn't about gifts or food. It was about leverage, timing, and the quiet satisfaction of watching the entitled face the consequences of their mockery. The oven timer dinged, but I barely noticed. In the silence that followed Michael's insult, I felt a surge of clarity. The rules of engagement had changed. I had spent decades living by the law, paying my dues, filing paperwork, navigating mortgages, and quietly building a reputation in Erie that no one could erase. Tonight, those skills would become instruments of poetic justice. I cleared my throat. "Let's start dinner," I said, my voice calm but carrying an edge. Michael laughed again, oblivious, while Jenna nudged him playfully, unaware of the storm about to hit. The table was set, the candles flickering, the smell of roast and pine blending into a sense of ominous anticipation. I poured myself a glass of water and thought of the plans I had already set in motion. The bank visits, the mortgage records, the discreet conversations with attorneys. By the end of the night, I wouldn't just reclaim my dignity, I would expose their arrogance in the most inescapable way possible. I glanced at Michael's face, full of smugness, and felt the last trace of doubt evaporate. This wasn't just about Christmas. This was about proving that the foundations you build on deceit crumble when confronted with truth, patience, and resolve. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet excitement stirred. He would learn the cost of mocking someone who never truly lost hope. Michael's laughter had barely settled when I noticed something subtle, a slip in his posture, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He thought he had me cornered, a powerless relic of a past he didn't respect. But that was the beauty of underestimation. It gave me time. It gave me leverage. We ate in strained silence for a few minutes, the clatter of cutlery loud in the tension-filled room. Jenna, always the keen observer, shot me another smug glance. "Still bitter about last year's Christmas, Dad?" she asked, voice dripping with feigned innocence. I raised an eyebrow, carefully setting down my fork. "Bitter? No, Jenna. I just don't appreciate being called a joke by my own family. I imagine most people would at least consider the impact of their words before letting them fly." Michael snorted. "Impact? You mean like the impact of being overbearing and boring your whole life? That's what people remember? Boring. Overbearing. Those were words that cut, yes, but I didn't let them pierce my calm exterior. I had seen arrogance before in Erie. Neighbors who thought their houses defined their worth. Bankers who sneered at small-town paychecks. Relatives who believed wealth automatically conferred respect. Michael was no different. "You know, Michael," I said slowly, leaning back in my chair, "all these years I worked, not for recognition, not for admiration, but so that you wouldn't struggle, so that your future would be secure. And yet here I am, ridiculed by the very people I sacrificed for. It's ironic." Jenna's eyes narrowed. "Don't act like you did it all yourself. You had help, Dad." "Yes," I agreed softly. "Help from a community that respected honesty, hard work, and commitment. The kind of community that expects you to give back, not tear down your own father at the table." Michael rolled his eyes. "Community, Father. Community. That's irrelevant. People don't care about your morality. They care about the now." And there it was, the arrogance that would soon be his undoing. I had already started making calls before arriving tonight. I had quietly verified deeds, mortgage documents, and bank statements. The family believed the house, the money, and the legacy were theirs to claim without question. But I knew the truth. I knew the legal frameworks, and I knew how to wield them. "You're right," I said, voice calm but firm. "People do care about the now. That's why I've made sure to plan accordingly. And tonight, you're learning the cost of underestimating someone who doesn't act out of anger, but out of reason and preparation." Michael leaned back, dismissive. "Oh, here we go, the lecture again." "No lecture," I said softly. "Just a demonstration of how quickly assumptions can unravel." The tension was electric, the subtle sound of the wind outside brushing against the window. Michael didn't notice the lawyer's call I'd placed earlier, confirming the transfer of certain assets, ensuring the legal paperwork would arrive at the correct offices first thing tomorrow. He didn't know that small-town gossip had already begun to turn, that the town accountant had been quietly alerted. And Jenna? She still thought she was playing some sort of game, orchestrating humiliation. She had no idea the quiet power I carried, the knowledge, the patience, the meticulous planning accumulated over decades of hard work. I took a sip of water, letting the cold liquid sharpen my senses. Michael's arrogance, his laughter, it fueled me. Every mocking word was a spark, and I had a fire waiting to ignite. "You really think this is about Christmas?" I asked him, voice low, deliberate. "It's not. It's about responsibility, honesty, and respect. Qualities you've clearly never valued in me." The room went quiet. Even the children paused, sensing the tension. Michael's smirk faltered slightly, a brief glimpse of doubt crossing his face. It was subtle, but it was there. "You'll see," I continued, leaning in, "that the consequences of your words aren't always immediate. Sometimes they come quietly, through channels you've ignored or assumed were inconsequential, and when they hit, they leave no room for escape." Jenna frowned. "Dad, what are you—" "I'm just stating facts," I interrupted calmly, letting the weight of my words settle over the table like a fog. "Facts that Michael will have to reckon with very soon." She opened her mouth to retort, but I remained silent, letting the uncertainty do its work. The children looked at me with wide eyes, sensing a tension they hadn't understood before. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the window. It was a small sound, but it mirrored the storm I had quietly prepared. A storm that Michael could neither predict nor outrun. And as the first course of Christmas dinner ended, I felt a strange satisfaction. Calm, controlled, almost serene. Tonight, the family's arrogance had been laid bare, and I had the upper hand. This wasn't just a meal, it was the opening act of a reckoning long overdue. The holiday lights flickered, casting shadows across the room, shadows that would soon stretch longer than Michael anticipated. The next morning, I woke early in my small but comfortable Erie apartment, the aroma of brewing coffee filling the kitchen. My hands trembled slightly, not from anger, but from anticipation. Every document I had painstakingly gathered, every phone call I had quietly made, and every small-town contact I had leaned on was about to converge. Michael, oblivious, was still reeling from the tension at last night's dinner. I knew his type well: arrogant, impatient, and completely blind to subtleties. He thought he could dismiss me, belittle me, and control the narrative. But I had the truth tucked safely in the folds of legal paperwork, waiting for the right moment. I poured myself a cup of coffee, letting the steam warm my face, and reviewed the documents once more. The property deeds, the mortgage statements, the notarized affidavits confirming my name on the accounts, everything was in perfect order. Michael had tried to claim entitlement, assuming I would never challenge him. He thought the house, the money, the legacy were his by default. But as any man who has fought life's quiet battles knows, preparation always wins where arrogance fails. By 10 a.m., I was at Henderson and Myers' law offices, the polished floors gleaming under the fluorescent lights. I handed my lawyer, Mr. Carl Benson, the final stack of paperwork. He gave me a small nod, his gray eyes reflecting a mix of admiration and caution. "Everything set?" I asked. "Yes, Mr. Matthews," he replied. "Once we file these motions, the court will recognize your claims immediately. Michael won't see it coming. It's airtight." I allowed myself a small smile. This wasn't about vengeance for the sake of anger. It was about restoring dignity, asserting fairness, and letting the arrogance of my family meet the consequences of their assumptions. Later that afternoon, I made a few discreet phone calls. Local banks, accountants, and even a couple of the town's council members were quietly informed of the situation. Michael and Jenna had underestimated me for decades, believing small-town bureaucracy and family obligations were tools they could exploit. They had no idea the ripple I was about to create. When I arrived at the courthouse, the familiar smell of polished wood and faint ink filled my senses. I took a deep breath and entered the small, crowded courtroom. Michael and Jenna were already there, sitting smugly in the front row, whispering to each other. "You really think this will work?" Jenna hissed under her breath. I only smiled, calmly taking a seat in the designated area for plaintiffs. The judge, a stern woman named Ruth Davenport, called the courtroom to order. "Mr. Matthews, your motion?" she asked. I stood, documents in hand. "Your Honor, my family has attempted to claim assets and property that are legally in my name, through assumptions and disregard for the law. I am here to ensure that ownership and rights are properly recognized." The judge nodded, scanning the papers. "I see. And you have provided notarized proof, bank statements, and legal verification of ownership?" "Yes, Your Honor, all verified and current." Michael's smirk began to fade. This can't be," he whispered. The tension in the courtroom thickened. I remained calm, my voice steady. Every eye in the room was on me, every subtle movement scrutinized. It was a performance of quiet power, controlled, deliberate, unyielding. The judge began reviewing the documentation, flipping through the pages carefully. I noticed Michael's hands trembling slightly, Jenna's confident posture now wavering. The court reporter typed diligently, each keystroke echoing like a drumbeat of impending justice. Finally, Judge Davenport looked up, her gaze sharp. "Mr. Matthews, the documentation is thorough. The claims of the defendants are unsubstantiated in the context of these verified records. Ownership and financial rights are recognized in your name. Case closed." A stunned silence followed. Michael's face went pale. Jenna's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The weight of their assumptions, of years of entitlement, had collapsed instantly under the steady force of legality and preparation. I felt a rush of vindication, but more importantly, a sense of peace. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about justice. Every mocking word, every dismissal, every laugh that had landed in my ear for years had led to this moment. And now, the tables had turned. Outside the courthouse, the cold, eerie wind bit at my cheeks. But it didn't matter. I had reclaimed not just my property, but my dignity. Michael and Jenna walked behind me, their pride shattered, their entitlement dissolved. I let the satisfaction settle. There would be no need for further confrontation. The law had spoken. The arrogance that had fueled them had become their undoing. And yet, even in that victory, I felt a quiet anticipation. Small-town life rarely keeps secrets, and the reverberations of this case would ripple through Erie. How Michael and Jenna would recover, or fail to, remained unseen. But one thing was certain. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from ridicule, free from assumption, free from the weight of others' disrespect. And that, I realized, was a treasure far greater than any material inheritance. The news spread faster than I anticipated. By mid-morning, whispers ran through Erie like wildfire. At the diner on Main Street, Mrs. Callahan nearly dropped her coffee when she saw me enter. "Is it true? You won?" she asked, voice trembling with excitement. I simply nodded, the faintest smile tugging at my lips. Word reached Michael and Jenna even before I did. By noon, their small circle of friends, co-workers, and acquaintances were quietly avoiding eye contact whenever I passed. Erie was a town that loved its gossip, and I had just become the headline. But I didn't celebrate. Not yet. True satisfaction, I had learned, comes not from immediate triumph, but from the calm aftermath of a storm you've carefully engineered. Later that day, I received a call from Mr. Benson. "Michael's threatening to file an appeal," he said, voice cautious. "He's furious. Says you cheated him." I laughed softly, almost quietly enough that he didn't hear it. "Cheated? No, Carl. I simply followed the law." "Still," he warned, "he's angry. You might want to be careful." I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth of my office heater brush against my face. Carl, Michael, and Jenna made their choices years ago. Their arrogance has consequences. Let them stew. By late afternoon, I received a notification from the bank. All financial transfers and mortgage corrections had been processed. The house was fully mine, every account and lien cleared. It was more than paperwork. It was proof that the life I had quietly built, the sacrifices I had made, were finally recognized, not by my family, but by law and community alike. That evening, I drove past the Matthews family home. Michael and Jenna were inside, doors locked, voices muffled. Their lawn, usually pristine, was in mild disarray, a subtle reflection of the chaos they couldn't control. I slowed for a moment, letting the sight sink in. For years, they had looked down on me, dismissed me, called me irrelevant. And now, their own home, where they had assumed I had no claim, stood under the shadow of my victory. I took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. The satisfaction wasn't loud or explosive. It was calm, deliberate, and deeply personal. The poetic justice wasn't in embarrassment. It was in reclaiming what was rightfully mine. The next day, Erie buzzed even more. Local news picked up the story. Matthew's father wins legal battle against arrogant son and daughter-in-law. I read it with quiet amusement. Headlines could never capture the full measure of satisfaction, but for the town, it was enough. I knew the truth. Michael's ridicule, his laughter at family gatherings, his casual insults, they had all been erased, replaced with the undeniable fact that he had been wrong. Even at the grocery store, small smiles and nods greeted me. People I had known for years looked at me differently. Not with pity, not with fear, but with respect. It was subtle, but it mattered. Respect earned quietly is far more powerful than any loud triumph. That evening, I walked into my living room, sitting by the window as the eerie skyline glowed in the soft, amber light of dusk. My hands rested on the arm of my chair, and I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Michael and Jenna would rebuild, perhaps. But every action they took now would be cautious, measured, shadowed by the awareness that their entitlement had failed spectacularly. And me, I had peace, dignity restored, quiet strength renewed, and a calm satisfaction that only comes when you've played the long game. And justice, quiet, deliberate, unassailable, has prevailed. I sipped my tea, listening to the faint hum of the city. Erie, small as it was, had witnessed a story of arrogance meeting reality. And in that reality, I had emerged whole, intact, unshaken by the petty cruelty of those who once claimed to be family. I smiled, a quiet, victorious smile. The battle had ended. The court had spoken. And while Michael and Jenna would remember this defeat for years, I would remember the calm, deliberate reclaiming of my life and the extraordinary peace it brought. Sometimes, the loudest justice is not shouted, it is lived, and I intended to live it fully. The morning sunlight spilled through the blinds of my study, casting long lines across the oak floor. I sat at my desk, reviewing the final statements from the bank. Every transaction confirmed what I already knew. I had regained control, not just of property or finances, but of the narrative of my own life. I heard a cautious knock on the door. It was Carl, my lawyer, still carrying a hint of disbelief on his face. I have to admit, Michael never expected you to fight back. Or to win, he said, shaking his head. I didn't fight to win, Carl, I replied calmly. I fought to prove the truth. The rest is consequence. Outside, the Matthews family was stirring in the neighborhood gossip circuit. I learned that Jenna had called her friends in panic. Michael tried to argue with local business owners, and even extended family members were taking sides. Their pride had been bruised, their facade shattered. But that wasn't my concern anymore. My concern was peace. My concern was dignity regained. By late afternoon, I decided to pay a quiet visit to the house that had once been theirs. Or at least, the one they thought they controlled. The air smelled faintly of winter frost, and pine from the small trees lining the street. As I walked past, I noticed the subtle signs of disarray. Mail piled in the mailbox, a garden hose carelessly coiled, a swing swaying empty. It was a muted image of chaos, and it carried with it a quiet satisfaction. Yet, as I turned away, I heard footsteps approaching. It was Mrs. Callahan, carrying her signature casserole dish. I wanted to say congratulations, she said, her eyes bright but wary. Well, you've handled this with more grace than I could have imagined. I smiled at her, feeling the weight of years of misunderstanding finally lift. Thank you, Mary. That means more than you know. The evening settled into quiet reflection. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, listening to the soft hum of Erie as street lights flickered on one by one. The town had seen the downfall of arrogance and entitlement, and in its quiet approval, I found something priceless, acknowledgement of truth and justice. I remembered Michael's laughter, so sharp and dismissive at the reading of the will, the smugness in his eyes when he thought the house and inheritance would be his by default. And now that laughter was gone, replaced by silence. Silence heavy with the understanding that life doesn't bend to entitlement. It bends to honesty, integrity, and patience. Over the next few weeks, the Matthews family tried subtle attempts to regain control. They reached out to banks, whispered in local shops, and even tried to challenge small claims. But the law was on my side, the town had seen the record, and their every attempt faltered. I had done nothing illegal, nothing cruel. I had simply protected what was mine and allowed truth to prevail. One evening, I walked into the diner, the familiar smells of coffee and fresh pies greeting me. A few nods here, a quiet hello there. It felt like a soft victory lap, not boisterous, not loud, just a calm acknowledgement that I had endured, resisted, and emerged with integrity intact. And then, a small voice from behind me made me chuckle. "Dad?" I turned to see my daughter Lily, her eyes wide with curiosity and pride. "You really did it," she said softly. You proved them wrong." I reached for her hand, holding it firmly. "Lily, this wasn't about proving anyone wrong. This was about living with honesty, keeping your head high, and protecting what matters. That's the only lesson worth remembering." She nodded, her face thoughtful. "And they'll never forget it, right?" "They'll never forget it," I said, voice steady but calm. "But that's their burden, not ours." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in amber and rose, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. Michael and Jenna had lost more than money. They had lost the illusion of control. Their arrogance, their dismissiveness, and their entitlement had met the immovable force of patience, law, and dignity. And in that, I found peace. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to sit back, truly relax, and breathe. Erie's streets outside were quiet, but inside, my life had never felt louder, fuller, or more complete. I raised my cup of tea to the fading light, whispering to myself, justice isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, deliberate, and perfect. And with that, the long, painful, and ultimately victorious chapter of my life closed, not with a shout, but with a calm, victorious smile. Tell us your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories.